Hi, I'm Wendy. Welcome to my Westcoast garden. Today it is absolutely pouring outside, one of the hazards of living in a rainforest. Anyway, it's not such a great day to garden, but it's an excellent day to think about planning your garden. Here is a look at my plan for 2019. I like to plan my garden out for a couple of reasons. Probably the most important one is that I live on a city lot that's on the smallest size, and so I have limited space to garden. Then when you add in the buildings and trees that shade my property and the areas that are the water table's too high and so they're not great for growing things, the real estate is kind of limited. So I want to make sure I make the most of the space that I do have throughout the growing season. So I do that in a couple of ways. The crops that overwinter and the crops that I plant in the early spring are usually being pulled up or are finishing off by the time I want to plant the summer crops, the warmer weather ones like tomatoes and peppers. So to me, I like to plan that all out in a rainy day, well, probably in February when I'm itching to get out into the garden, but it's really just too miserable. But I'm showing you on a rainy day in April where it's equally miserable out there. Anyway, I like to plan because then when it is warm and lovely outside, I've got a game plan. The other thing a plan does is that it allows me to keep track of what I'm rotating from year to year because, as I say, I've got not a ton of space and you want to rotate your plants for a couple of reasons. The main theory around crop rotation is that like breeds like. So you want to put plants that are in groups that do well together based on certain factors like soil condition, what's susceptible to the same pests, and on the plants that do well growing in companion. So figuring out what grows well together is based in part on soil pH. I won't get too scientific, but suffice to say, if you want to make the most of your garden, it's really helpful to learn the basics of soil science. Essentially, soil has different pH levels based on a variety of different factors. Primarily where you live will determine that and what made the soil in the first place. pH is a measure of hydrogen ions in the soil that determine whether plants can access certain micro or macro nutrients. The H stands for hydrogen. No one's really sure what the P stands for. Some people say it's potential hydrogen, but apparently the scientist who came up with the term never explained where he got the P from. Most plants like to be in a neutral pH, which is 7, or slightly acidic, which is kind of around the 6 zone, and most plants won't grow below about a pH of 4 or above a pH of 7.5 or 8. But that doesn't really matter for what we're talking about. pH is measured on a scale of 1 to 14, 7 being neutral, 14 being alkaline, and 1 being acid. With a few exceptions, most plants like to be in the mid to low range, so in slightly acidic soil. When plants aren't in soil with the right pH, they aren't able to access the micro and macronutrients that are in the soil and that they need to thrive and survive. So no matter how much you amend your soil with compost or with organic fertilizer that's non-soluble, the roots really can't access the nutrients if your soil pH doesn't allow them to do that. You can add soluble fertilizers, but I'm not going to get into an explanation or a dialogue on whether you want to do that because most of them are chemical and many people would prefer to garden organically. You might read about tomatoes, for example, getting blossom end rot because they don't have enough calcium. Well, adding more calcium to the soil is probably not going to help them because chances are there's calcium in the soil. It's just that the tomatoes aren't able to access it for one reason or another. Depending on where you live, your soil is likely to be more alkaline or more acid. I live in a rainforest, and in areas where it rains a lot, tends to be on the acid side. In my yard, I happen to be right. Most of my beds are pretty much at a 7. So I don't really need to do anything to them. Maybe do something to bring the, to make them a little bit more acidic, if any. But before you do anything to your soil, make sure you check the pH. And I've got a pH meter that I picked up at Lee Valley that, I don't know, people say they're not that accurate, but for the purposes of a garden like mine, they're probably fine. You can also get a soil sample and look up, Google what's in your area where you can take a soil sample, and you can get a reading of what the pH in your soil is like. That's super accurate, and as well some recommendations on what to add to it to get to the pH that you need to grow what you're. Just remember, if you add lime to your soil or anything else to change the pH, it's going to take a few weeks to take effect. So don't expect that you can add it and just see immediate results. Anyway, back to my garden plan. So part of the theory of crop rotation is that you divide your garden into 3 or more, if you have the space, different crops which do well together, as I said before, and then you move them from year to year. You do this for a couple of reasons. One is that some plants like more or less acid in the soil. Some plants like peas and beans add nutrients to the soil, and some plants like brasilics are heavy feeders and they need that in the soil that they grow. Another piece is complementary plants. So you might have seen tomatoes growing with basil. That's because basil both attracts the pollinators that the tomatoes need, but it also deters the pests that harm your tomatoes. Complementary planting, I find them personally a little bit confusing because there's no logic to it. It's just some things do well together and some things don't do well together. Don't plant onions near your strawberries or beans. Plant basil near your tomatoes. Personally, I have to look it up every year. I'm not clear on the science of why complementary plantings work, just that they seem to be beneficial, and there's lots of anecdotal evidence that I've found which supports that. So year 1, if your soil is on the acid side, lime it so it's in the kind of 6 to 7 neutral zone, and plant your basilics like cabbage and Brussels sprouts and cauliflower. Then in year 2, plant your root crops like carrots and beets, as well as solanums like peppers and tomatoes. Then in year 3, plant squashes, greens, peas, and beans. You can see that in my garden, I've also planted those greens in a couple of the beds that get the best spring sun. Spinach tolerates a variety of different conditions, so you can companion plant it wherever you'd like. With the greens for the spring, I've planted them in the beds that get the best light in the early part of the spring, because most of those greens will be done by the time I'm ready to plant those crops that thrive in warmer weather. Thanks for joining me in my West Coast garden. Good luck in planning and planting your garden this year.